October 1944. A ridgeline near Arracourt, France. Rain soaks the mud into a thick paste that clings to boots and tank treads alike. In a shallow, water-filled slit trench, a group of American infantrymen huddles together for warmth. They are waiting for the signal to advance. The air is heavy with the smell of wet wool and burnt cordite. A single hand reaches into a breast pocket, fumbling for a metal tube. It is a flare gun. The man holding it is not looking at his notes or his maps. He is looking at the dark horizon with a narrow, focused stare. He pulls the trigger. A streak of brilliant crimson light cuts through the low clouds, hanging over the American lines like a fresh wound. Within seconds, the ground begins to shake. The screaming sound of incoming shells fills the air. It is the sound of American artillery, and it is landing exactly where the red light falls. Patton would eventually see the bodies, but first, he would see the man who fired the light. The general was about to show a careless officer exactly what it cost to trust a memory over a checklist. This is the story of a commander who thought his rank made him immune to mistakes, only to have his pride answered by the thunder of his own guns. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. From the front lines to the command tents, we look at the choices that defined the war. Corporal Timothy Chen was 22 years old and hailed from the fog-swept streets of San Francisco, California. He served as the company radioman for a unit that had seen the worst of the hedgerow fighting in Normandy. Chen was the son of immigrants who had saved every penny to send him to university, but the war had interrupted his dreams of becoming an engineer. He was a man of precision and quiet observation. He carried a heavy radio on his back, but in his mind, he carried the lifeblood of the company, the signal codes. He knew that in the chaos of a night engagement, a single mistranslated word, or a wrong color in the sky, was the difference between a successful advance and a massacre. He had already lost his best friend to a sniper outside St. Lo, and the weight of that loss made him meticulous. He checked his equipment 3 times before every move. He memorized the daily signal cards until he could recite them in his sleep. For Chen, the small details were the only things keeping the darkness at bay. Captain Marcus Webb was 34 years old and came from a world of country clubs and inherited influence in Tampa, Florida. He walked with a polished confidence that bordered on disdain for those he commanded. Webb viewed the war as a series of administrative hurdles to be cleared on his way to a post-war political career. He wore a tailored field jacket and kept his boots buffed to a shine. Even in the French mud, to Webb, his rank was not just a responsibility. It was a testament to his natural superiority. He frequently spoke of his time in the Mediterranean theater as if he were the sole architect of the Allied strategy there. He often said that a good officer relies on his gut and his experience, not on the scribblings of some clerk in a rear echelon office. He treated the updated signal plans as mere suggestions, often relying on the codes he had used months prior in Sicily. On that rainy night near Arracourt, Webb stood at the edge of the trench with a flare gun in his hand and a refusal to listen in his heart. By October 1944, the race across France had slowed to a grueling crawl. The rapid breakout from Normandy was a memory, replaced by the reality of a stiffened German defense and the logistical nightmare of overextended supply lines. Near Arracourt, the Third Army was engaged in a vicious seesaw of tank battles and infantry skirmishes. Rain had turned the Lorraine countryside into a quagmire, making every hill and every stone farmhouse a fortress that had to be paid for in blood. In this environment, communication was not just a convenience. It was the only thing that kept the massive American machine from grinding itself to pieces. Artillery was the primary killer on the battlefield, a terrifying force of nature that could be summoned with a single radio call or a burst of colored light. Because of the constant danger of radio interception or equipment failure, signal plans changed daily. Pyrotechnics were the fallback, a visual language designed to be understood when words failed. Other officers in the sector were exhausted, their nerves frayed by weeks of constant shelling and lack of sleep. Many had begun to cut corners, trusting to luck or the familiarity of their routines. It was a dangerous atmosphere where a small lapse in discipline could ripple upward, turning a local maneuver into a theater-wide disaster. The division command had issued strict orders regarding the new signal cards, emphasizing that older plans were compromised and must be discarded. Most commanders carried these cards like talismans, knowing that the wrong shade of light in the night sky was an invitation to a funeral. But for some, the habit of authority was a stronger force than the reality of the evolving war. The stage was set for a confrontation between a man who valued his memory and a reality that demanded absolute precision. Captain Webb checked his watch and then looked at the heavy rain falling across the ridgeline. He reached for the flare gun on the edge of the trench. Corporal Chen shifted the weight of the radio on his back and stepped closer, his voice low but urgent. "Sir, we should verify the colors before we signal the shift," Chen said. Webb didn't turn around. "I know the plan, Corporal," he replied. Chen pulled a small, laminated card from his own pocket. "The new orders came in this morning. Sir, red is for fire for effect. Green is the shift forward." Webb finally looked at him, his face tightening with a cold, practiced arrogance. "I have been reading signal plans since you were in high school," he said. Chen didn't flinch. He held the card out. "It only takes a second to be sure, sir. 11 men are depending on this signal being right." Webb pushed the card away with the barrel of the flare gun. "I don't need a lecture on responsibility from a radioman who just got his stripes. In Sicily, red was the shift. In Italy, red was the shift. I have a memory for these things." Chen tried one last time. "That was a different operation, Captain. The Germans have our old codes. That's why they changed them. The signal plan in your pocket says red means fire for effect right here on our own coordinates." Webb snapped. "Stop questioning officers. Corporal, that is an order. If I say it's a red flare, it's a red flare. Now get back to that radio and tell the battalion we are moving out once the shells stop falling." Chen watched as Webb turned back to the dark horizon. The captain didn't even reach for the breast pocket where his own signal card sat, untouched and unread. He simply raised the flare gun and pulled the trigger. The red light hissed as it climbed into the air, casting a bloody glow over the American trenches. Within seconds, the first distant thuds of the 105s echoed from the rear. Chen felt the air pressure change as the shells began to scream overhead. They weren't passing over the company. They were falling short. The first explosion tore into the earth 40 yards away, showering the trench in mud and shrapnel. Then came the next 10. By the time the radio reached the artillery commander to cease fire, 11 men were gone. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep splashed through the rising pools of muddy water. Coming to a sharp halt behind the command post, he stepped out into the rain, every inch of his uniform sharp and deliberate. The 4 stars on his helmet caught the dull gray light, and the ivory grips of his revolvers rested against his hips. He did not look at the cratered earth or the medics working in the distance. He looked only at Captain Webb. The officers in the vicinity froze, the air in the tent suddenly feeling thinner as the general walked in. He did not shout. He did not throw his gloves. He simply stood there, dripping water onto the floorboards, and waited for the silence to become unbearable. "Captain Webb, did you fire a red flare tonight?" Patton asked. His voice was a low, raspy whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I did, General," Webb replied, his voice wavering for the first time. "And what was your understanding of that signal?" Patton asked, stepping closer. "I believed it was the signal to shift fire forward, General. It was the protocol we used in the previous campaign." Patton nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Webb's face. "Did you have the current signal card in your possession?" Webb swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, in my pocket." "And did your radioman, Corporal Chen, attempt to correct your memory before you fired?" Webb looked down at his boots. "He did, General. I thought he was mistaken." Patton leaned in, his face inches from the captain's. "You thought he was mistaken," Patton said. "You had the truth in your pocket, a piece of paper that took 2 seconds to read. You carried the lives of your men in that same pocket, and you couldn't be bothered to move your hand 6 inches to save them. You chose to be right instead of being a commander. You traded 11 American lives for the comfort of your own arrogance. You sat there and told a man who had the facts that he was wrong because you didn't like his rank. That isn't combat pressure, Captain. That is criminal negligence born of a swollen head." Patton straightened his back, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. "There are 2 kinds of mistakes in this man's army. There are the mistakes of the bold, which I can forgive. And there are the mistakes of the vain, which I will not tolerate. You will not lead another man in this theater. You will not carry a weapon. You have a choice. You can face a court-martial for the negligent homicide of 11 soldiers. Or you can spend the rest of this war performing the exact duty you felt was beneath you. You will carry the signal cards. You will verify every flare. But you will do it from the bottom of the pile. Decide now. Webb said nothing, his face pale as he realized his career was over. He nodded once, a broken man. Patton did not wait for the morning to impose his sentence. He ordered the company gathered in the mud, forming a hollow square under the flickering light of handheld lanterns. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and wet earth. Corporal Chen stood at the front, his eyes fixed straight ahead, while Captain Webb was marched into the center of the formation. By Patton's direct order, the captain was stripped of his sidearm and his rank insignia in front of the men he had endangered. He was then handed a heavy wooden crate filled with pyrotechnic flares and a stack of signal cards. Patton's verdict was clear. Webb would not be sent to the rear, nor would he be given the dignity of a cell. Instead, he was assigned as the new assistant radioman for the very platoon he had shelled. For the next 72 hours, Webb was forced to crawl through the mud alongside Corporal Chen, carrying the physical weight of the communication gear. Every time a signal was required, Webb had to pull the card from his pocket, read the color aloud to Chen, and wait for the corporal to verify the instruction before the flare could be loaded. The soldiers watched in a heavy, judgmental silence as their former commander, now a nameless private in a muddy field jacket, fumbled with the cards in the rain. Every burst of light in the sky was a reminder of the 11 men who were no longer there to see it. Webb felt the eyes of the survivors on his back, a weight far heavier than the radio equipment he was now forced to carry. Timothy Chen returned to San Francisco in late 1945. He never became the engineer he had dreamed of being before the war. The memories of that night on the ridgeline stayed with him, manifesting as a lifelong obsession with safety and precision. He found work as a local inspector for the city's electrical grid, a job where a single mistake could be fatal. He was known for being the most thorough man on the payroll, often checking a circuit 3 times before allowing power to flow. He died in 1998, leaving behind a small collection of military memorabilia, including a worn, laminated signal card from October 1944. He had kept it in his wallet for over 50 years as a reminder that life is often held together by the smallest of details. Marcus Webb survived the war, though he never regained his commission. He was officially discharged in 1946 with a record that barred him from the political career he had so desperately craved. He returned to Florida and attempted to enter the real estate market, but the story of the wrong flare followed him through the veteran networks of Tampa. He became a quiet, bitter man who spent his later years writing letters to the War Department, seeking to have his record expunged. He claimed the pressure of command had been misunderstood, but his appeals were consistently denied. He passed away in 1974, largely forgotten by the men he had served with. Patton never mentioned Webb by name in his public memoirs, but he did keep a private note about the incident in a small leather-bound diary found after his death. He wrote that the greatest enemy of the American soldier was not the German 88, but the ego of an officer who believed he had nothing left to learn. In a letter to a friend in 1945, Patton remarked that he had seen many men die for a cause, but only a fool would let them die for a mistake that could be corrected by a single glance at a pocket-sized card. To Patton, the 11 men lost at Arracourt were a debt he could never truly settle. Some historians argue that Patton's decision to demote an officer on the spot was a reckless display of grandstanding that bypassed the formal military justice system. They suggest that such public humiliations could damage officer morale and create a climate of fear that discouraged independent thought during the chaos of combat. Other historians argue the exact opposite, maintaining that Patton's swift and mirrored punishment was the only effective way to instill absolute discipline in a citizen army prone to shortcuts. They believe his refusal to tolerate negligence saved thousands of lives by turning a single tragic error into a permanent lesson for the entire command. What is certain is that after the Arracourt incident, the casualty rates from friendly fire in the Third Army dropped significantly as the mandatory verification of signal plans became a standard survival protocol for every unit under Patton's Iron Watch. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply dismissed the captain to a desk job behind the lines? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.